Fagan, curator of the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, and it is our great pleasure to participate in the Presidential Primary Sources Project again. Our museum is located in Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas, Texas, at the site of the Kennedy assassination. Here is our building, one of the world's most famous warehouses, the former Texas School Book Depository building, where shots were fired at President Kennedy's limousine more than 61 years ago on November 22nd, 1963. And today's program is called 2 Days in Texas, November 21st and 22nd, 1963. You may have heard a little bit about the assassination on November 22nd. It's a major historical event in the 20th century. And what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today is the lead up to that moment, the last 2 days of President Kennedy's life and what his visit to Texas can teach us about the 1960s and the impact that President Kennedy had on people, not just in the state of Texas, but around the world. To set the scene today, I want to start going back to 1960, the presidential election of 1960. You can see the election map on the screen here today. So that 1960 election was a race between Republican candidate Vice President Richard Nixon and the Democratic candidate Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, and it was very close. In fact, it was one of the closest presidential races in American history. You can see, looking at the pie chart on the right here, that Kennedy got 49.7% of the popular vote to Nixon's 49.6%. And so that's actually a national difference of less than 120,000 votes. Very, very close. You can also see, if you look at the map, the different colors on the map, that 3 states, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Alabama, cast protest electoral votes for Virginia Senator Harry Byrd. He was a Southern segregationist opposed to the civil rights movement. And that actually kind of speaks to the changing political climate in the South, which is part of our story today as we look at these 2 days in Texas. Notice Texas there. It cast 24 electoral votes for Senator John F. Kennedy in 1960, but Kennedy only won the state of Texas by 2%, and that was with a native Texan, Lyndon Johnson, on the ticket as his vice presidential candidate. So a very, very close but crucial race in the state of Texas. Now, by 1963, looking ahead, Texas politics had changed, in part because in the summer of 1963, President Kennedy had come out in vocal support of civil rights. And that was helping to divide the historically Democratic state of Texas into 2 factions, a progressive wing and a conservative wing of the Democratic Party. And Kennedy embarked upon a whirlwind 5-city tour of Texas within the midst of this political climate in the fall of 1963. The plan was to visit, in order, San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Austin. He was hosted by the man you see in the picture here, wearing the cowboy hat and shaking hands. That is Texas Governor John Connally. The goal of this trip was really to shore up political support and set the stage for Kennedy to have a successful re-election campaign in 1964, because Kennedy needed to carry Texas once again. And of course, this trip, which was so crucial to his 1964 re-election campaign, was cut short right here in Dallas, outside of this building in Dealey Plaza, when President Kennedy was killed on the second day of his visit on November 22nd, 1963. Everything begins in San Antonio, where the Kennedys arrived on Thursday, November 21st at 1:30 in the afternoon. Today, we're going to join the Kennedys on this trip to Texas, and we're going to hear from people that saw or met the president during his visit, in the hopes that their voices will provide a window into the mindset of the nation and give us a better understanding of why the death of this one individual so deeply impacted the nation and the world. We're also going to look at original photographs, artifacts, and hear excerpts from the president's speeches, because as he traveled across Texas, he addressed issues that would be very important as the 1960s progressed, including civil rights, the space program, and the Vietnam War, all reflected in his words as he traveled across Texas. Another reason that the trip to Texas in the fall of 1963 was special was because of the presence of this lady right here, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. Very, very popular First Lady, and she accompanied the president, which was not something she characteristically did during his time in the White House. In fact, this was Jackie Kennedy's first public trip since the death of the Kennedys' infant son, Patrick, in August of 1963. Her involvement escalated the stakes for the visit and helped increase the national attention that was focused on Texas. The Kennedys were only in San Antonio for 2.5 hours, but it was a jam-packed trip. The president began with a motorcade that went right through downtown San Antonio, where 125,000 people, including a number of school kids, turned out to greet the presidential party.
The day before President Kennedy was shot, he was to come to San Antonio. He was to go to Brooks Air Force Base and view what they were doing with the astronauts. And so his plane landed at the airport and went through town on Broadway to Brooks. And when I was at Alamo Heights Middle School at that time, junior school, and we weren't middle, we were junior. They had us, we were 1 block off of Broadway. So we as a school walked from the school, which in reality ended up being about 5 blocks. We walked over to Broadway and then down Broadway, and we covered like 2 or 3 blocks of Broadway just in the school kids. And so our last vision of him was as he and Mrs. Kennedy went by, you know, we were all waving and screaming and everything. And then he left there to go to Brooks, and then from Brooks he had some meeting that night.
The Kennedys were headed to Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio because of the space program. Specifically, President Kennedy was there to dedicate the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine. Now, what this facility did was to basically use cutting-edge technology to optimize human health and performance in space. And that work was going to be very important if the United States was going to land a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s, which was a commitment that John F. Kennedy had made. At the time, we were in this space race with the Soviet Union, rushing to try and be the first nation to successfully put a man on the moon. And so we're going to take just a moment here and listen to an excerpt from President Kennedy's speech, and listen to it and imagine how you would feel if you were in the audience at Brooks Air Force Base that day. President Kennedy had this soaring and inspirational rhetoric, which I hope you'll pick up on as he talks about America looking towards the future and what role space plays in that.
From Brooks Air Force Base, Texas, November 21st, 1963.
For more than 3 years, I've spoken about the new frontier. This is not a partisan term, and it's not the exclusive property of Republicans or Democrats. It refers instead to this nation's place in history, to the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an era to be characterized by achievement and by challenge. It is an era which calls for action, and for the best efforts of all those who would test the unknown and the uncertain in every phase of human endeavor. It is a time for pathfinders and pioneers. I have come to Texas today to salute an outstanding group of pioneers, the men who manned the Brooks Air Force Base School of Aerospace Medicine and the Aerospace Medical Center. It is fitting that San Antonio should be the site of this center and this school as we gather to dedicate this complex of buildings. For this city has long been the home of the pioneers in the air. And in the new frontier of outer space, history is being made every day by the men and women of the Aerospace Medical Center, without whom there could be no history.
Kennedy always had a way of kind of articulating the best in all of us and encouraging people, particularly young people, to invest in their country and try to give back in some way, and space was a big part of how he was looking forward towards the future at that time. In the crowd at Brooks that day was a young San Antonio high school student named Lee Alvoyd. She was a student journalist, and she had the rare privilege of getting to meet President and Mrs. Kennedy and having a brief personal exchange with them while they were there at Brooks. Let's hear her story.
At that time, I was one of the editors on the school newspaper, and he was doing a press conference and a dedication of the new aerospace building at Brooks Army facility, that base. And so it was a general press conference for the broader press. But what he scheduled was a high school press conference after the big one. And we were on actually the tarmac of the, of where they flew the planes in and everything. They set up the press conference out there, and the building was close by. And because I remember being on the tarmac, and their car was parked on the tarmac. Their limousine was parked on the tarmac. And so I think they invited like 2 to 3 journalists from the major high schools in San Antonio ISD, which, if you know anything about San Antonio, there are a lot of ISDs, but I think it was mostly focused on the city, the urban ISD. And we could come and do our own interview of President Kennedy. So there was I went, the editor of the paper, and then we took a photographer, and we were the only high school team that brought a photographer. And so we got sort of preferential seating because we had the photographer. So we got to interact really closely, and Jackie was there. Jackie was with him. I got to ask him a lot of questions, more about things that apply to students, college loans, funding. Probably it wasn't heavy-laden political issues at that time. I think there were some questions, as I recall, about the war and the threat of, the peace on earth type considerations of the kind of optimistic naivety of high school kids. And because we were the only team that brought a photographer, we got to linger and take pictures. They allowed us to take pictures. And we got to actually walk them to their car and talk to them on a more personal level as our photographer was capturing the pictures. And that was like in the afternoon of the day before he was assassinated. He came to Dallas the next day. And so it was such a, I think because I got to meet him and got to interact with him on a fairly personal level, it was just an even greater blow, although it was a blow to all of us, when that announcement came over the PA system the next day about the assassination. But I also felt very privileged. I felt like, taking advantage of an opportunity, being in the right place at the right time, that kind of thing has actually been a mantra through my whole career of trying to take advantage of opportunities that came along. And had we turned down that opportunity to go to that press conference, had I not had a journalism teacher that arranged for us to go, that kind of thing, I would have really missed an important piece of history and of my life.
Taking advantage of opportunities. That was something Lee Alvoyd learned there in San Antonio with President Kennedy, and as she mentioned, she's carried that throughout her life. The Kennedys left San Antonio for a short flight over to Houston, Texas. Here they are arriving. They arrived at 4:45 in the afternoon, again on Thursday, November 21st. They had 2 stops in Houston. The first stop was pretty important. Kennedy was going to attend a gala for the League of United Latin American Citizens, an organization called LULAC. And this was actually quite significant looking back to the 1960 election. Kennedy had campaigned directly to Mexican-American voters, and it was really one of the first times that a presidential candidate had actively courted a Latino voting bloc. There were these Viva Kennedy clubs across the Southwest. You can see some political pins in our collection that reflect this. Kennedy hoped to reconnect with this community in 1964, and visiting the LULAC event in Houston was an important part of this plan. We're going to hear now from a young man who was there in the audience at LULAC, and listen to what he says, because he had a special connection with Jackie Kennedy, and he was quite thrilled to hear her address the crowd in Spanish. Let's listen to Roy Bateo.
I think that they knew the presidents of the organization, because when you're like in my position, there's people above you, they're planning, they're doing all this. And I know that they were aware that he was going to be there from here. I don't know who planned it or how, but when he walked in, oh, Lord. And so people say, well, weren't you people surprised that she could speak Spanish? I said, no, sir. I said, what are we surprised? We know her. We know she speaks Spanish. We know she understands. And the mariachis are playing behind her, and she knows the words that she. And the president, if you see it in the she just looks at. I hope you're enjoying this, because you didn't know what was going on.
It's interesting. You can see even 50 years, remembering that moment 50 years later. Roy Bateo was so touched that Mrs. Kennedy spoke in Spanish. You know, we know her. We know she understands. A very exciting moment. But this was not the first time that Mrs. Kennedy had spoke Spanish. You know, Roy Bateo said, we weren't surprised. We knew she spoke Spanish. And the reason they knew that was because Jackie Kennedy actually recorded the very first Spanish language presidential campaign commercial on television. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I want to play just an excerpt for you so you get a little bit of a flavor for how the Kennedy campaign directly addressed the Mexican-American community in 1960.
Queridos amigos, les habla la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. En estos tiempos de tanto peligro, cuando la paz mundial se ve amenazada por el comunismo, es necesario tener en la Casa Blanca un líder capaz de guiar nuestros destinos con una mano firme. Mi esposo siempre velará los intereses de todos los sectores de nuestra sociedad que necesitan la protección de un gobierno humanitario para el futuro de nuestros niños y para lograr un mundo donde exista la paz verdadera. Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. Que viva Kennedy.
All right, just wanted to play a segment of that so you could better hear and understand Mrs. Kennedy addressing the audience in Spanish. You know, President Kennedy's recognition of the Mexican-American community, it really did prove to be significant in the 1960s. Inspired by those Viva Kennedy clubs during the 1960 election, Latino leaders from organizations across the Southwest met to discuss the effort of how to affect political unity within the Latino community, and the result of that was a new organization, the Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations. And the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement became a major social movement in the 1960s, and it would later involve the president's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, during his run for the White House in 1968. The second stop in Houston was to honor a longtime Texas congressman named Albert Thomas. You can see Thomas in this picture here. He's the distinguished fellow wearing the bow tie and the glasses here. Thomas was retiring, and Kennedy, in part, was hoping this dinner would inspire him to run for re-election, which he did. Albert Thomas was influential in establishing NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, better known today as the Johnson Space Center. So again, the space program, very, very important in Texas and very important for the rest of the 1960s. I want to play another brief excerpt from Kennedy's speech that night where he talks again about the importance of the space program.
He has helped steer this country to its present eminence in space. Next month, when the United States of America fires the largest booster in the history of the world into space for the first time, giving us the lead, fires the largest payload into space, giving us the lead. It will be the largest payroll, too. And who should know that better than Houston? In 1990, the age of space will be entering its second phase, and our hopes in it to preserve the peace, to make sure that in this great new sea, as on Earth, the United States is second to none.
The Kennedys left Houston late that night, so we're still talking about Thursday, November 21st. They really did pack a lot into this trip to Texas. They've already been to San Antonio and Houston, and late that night, a little after 11 o'clock, they landed at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. And you know, one of the things when you look at historical events like this, you know, there's a lot of imagery, there's a lot of photography, and it's always exciting to look at historical images and try to pull out details and see what they can teach us, how we can better understand sort of the tenor of the times. And this is a great photo that has a lot of interesting information, even though the Kennedys aren't actually in it. You see, it's basically just a crowd shot that night in the dark at Carswell Air Force Base, but there's a lot to kind of unpack here. The first thing you might notice is the skyline of Fort Worth in the background, and that is the downtown skyline illuminated in amber Christmas lights. So Fort Worth had a holiday tradition at that time where 60 buildings downtown would turn on these lights for a holiday display every December. And Fort Worth as a community decided to run those lights, that holiday display, specifically for President Kennedy's arrival on November 21st. They knew that Kennedy would be arriving in the dark, and they wanted him to see Fort Worth from Air Force One, so they turned on their holiday lights, which is why we can see the city so clearly in the background. But I want to take a moment with you today and unpack this picture a little bit with the signs that we see this crowd holding, because we can learn a lot from political signs and political cartoons. So there's one there that says JFK, and there's 3 P's: peace, prosperity, and progress. We've already talked about how Kennedy was very forward-thinking and looking ahead with his kind of soaring, inspirational rhetoric, but the 3 P's here are significant, actually going back to the 1960 campaign. I want to share with you an artifact in our collection. This is a brochure from the 1960 campaign. Before campaigns had websites, they would often issue these paper brochures about different issues that the campaign was focused on, and this is an example of one. But I specifically want to look at the little logo at the bottom, because it has the 3 pillars of the Democratic Party at that time in 1960, and you can see 3 P words, but they're different P words: people, principle, and peace. So similar themes, but by 1963, one of those words is progress. And so we see the 3 pillars reflected in this handwritten sign that was held aloft for the Kennedys to see when they arrived at Carswell in Fort Worth. Going back to this picture again, let's look at the photograph on the sign on the far left. It reads Kennedy in 1964. Well, we've already talked about how Kennedy was in Texas gearing up for his re-election campaign in 1964, but when we examine a series of photographs taken from this vantage point, let me put another one up on the screen, we can see that the flip side of this sign says Goldwater in 1864. So we have Kennedy in 1964, Goldwater in 1864. Now what does that mean? Well, Goldwater refers to Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, and he was anticipated to be Kennedy's to run against Kennedy in 1964, and indeed he was the Republican nominee for president in '64 against Lyndon Johnson. But it's interesting that they say Goldwater in 1864 as opposed to Kennedy in 1964. Kennedy was, as I mentioned, forward-looking, and this really kind of speaks to Kennedy's progressive mindset, always looking towards the future, telling people to anticipate the country they want to live in 50 years or 100 years, whereas Barry Goldwater was seen, at least in the eyes of this one particular individual at Carswell, as backwards looking. And so they kind of use that little play, 1964 looking back to 1864. Goldwater was 10 years older than Kennedy. At that time, he was opposed to the upcoming civil rights legislation that was hoping to pass in 1964. Barry Goldwater was just seen as more traditional, more conservative, sort of backward looking, and we see that, and we can kind of infer that from the words on this the flip sides of this campaign sign. And what's interesting is, you know, when you study these historic photographs, you start to see patterns. And this particular sign that we see in the dead of night at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, look at this. It turns up again in Dallas the next day. So we see this young man, we see a much clearer picture. I assume it's the same man. The sign is identical, and it says Goldwater in 1864. He was along the parade route in Dallas the very next day with that same sign, Goldwater in 1864, Kennedy in 1964. Going back to this picture one last time, you might not be able to see it very clearly, but there's a little sign down there that says, "Welcome to Texas, Jack and Jackie." And we can't make much out of that sign. It's a little fuzzy, and this is a black and white photograph. And that's where artifacts become so special, bridging past to present and giving us a sense of what it was like to be there, because we have a sign just like that in our collection, and we can see it here in color. And look at it. It is red glitter. It's really exciting. This was a sign that was actually mass-produced in Fort Worth, and it was sold at Carswell Air Force Base and also at the Hotel Texas where the Kennedys stayed that night. So it's a great example of how an artifact can really illuminate black and white images of the time period. So I wanted to share that with you as well. And we'll see this sign turn up again. Just watch. Before we leave Carswell, I want to share with you a really poignant and enthusiastic memory shared by a woman named Betty Bacchus, who brought her entire family out to Carswell to see President Kennedy.
And the fever was generating, and we were all feeling so good and so happy. And the plane came and landed, and oh my God, we were so excited. And they opened the door, and when they opened the door, a Secret Service man got first in the door and, you know, looked around. And then he got back. Then Kennedy came and stood in the door, and oh my God, we went wild. And then he got back, he stepped back and brought Jackie out. And they came down the steps, Jackie, and then him, and the limousine is right there at the bottom of the steps. And when they got to the limousine, they walked around it and walked up to us like we were the only people there. We were so excited. We were in seventh heaven. He shook hands with us, and one of the girls with us said to Jackie, "You shouldn't be out so soon." She had just lost a baby, and she said, "Oh, I'm fine." And then Kennedy, the president, said to Mimi, "What are you doing out so late, young lady?" And she kissed his hand.
We get a sense as we hear these accounts that people frame their memories of President Kennedy through the lens of the assassination in Dallas. It makes every encounter, as happy as it was at the time, kind of bittersweet in respect, because there is that inevitability of what awaited in Dealey Plaza. And we really see that, don't we, reflected in the memories of Betty Bacchus. She did get to shake hands with President Kennedy at Carswell. And then the Kennedys got into a motorcade, and again, in the dead of night, almost midnight, we're approaching November 22nd. The Kennedys got to the Hotel Texas in downtown Fort Worth, and you can see this crowd outside the Hotel Texas. And just like I mentioned, there is another example of that Welcome to Texas Jack and Jackie sign. And now we know that that is a red glitter sign that would have greeted the Kennedys outside the hotel, even though it looks pretty plain in this black and white photograph. There was a young man, a high school student, who actually became a very prominent civil rights activist, who was in the crowd in the dark that day. And he's going to speak for a moment about how much it meant to him, for President Kennedy, to recognize those people in the dark. His name is Eddie Griffin.
We were not a visible people. In fact, I would say that we were an invisible people. And that's what attracted John Kennedy to the people outside of the Texas Hotel. We were all standing on this big empty lot where the convention center now is, all the way back. And there were no lights back in those days, and it was just all dark outside of the hotel. Only the in front of the hotel, the facade, was there lighting. And when the president got out of his limousine, he could hear people shouting from the dark. And they were, "We love you, Mr. President. God bless you, Mr. President. Thank you so much." You know, they were saying all of these things, but Kennedy couldn't see where this was coming from. This is where we were. We were out there in the dark. And I guess you would say I was nearly a block away. But a stir was in the crowd that something had happened. You know, and we were saying, "What happened? What happened?" And somebody say, "He got out on the wrong side of the limousine, and he's coming over here to shake people's hands." And so everybody there was kind of a surge forward, because we knew that this was unscripted. He was not supposed to come over here and shake hands with people who were totally in the dark, especially the fact that most were African Americans. And that gave us visibility. That gave us a sense of somebody knows that we're here. Somebody shined a light on us. Otherwise, we were an invisible people. So we loved Kennedy. We wanted him, his family. We wanted the world to know that we loved him, because kind of like President Barack Obama is doing with the Latino community, he brought us out of the shadow by shining the light on us and our cause for civil rights.
The next morning, Kennedy woke up in the Hotel Texas and addressed a large crowd outside, kind of an impromptu speech that he gave to the crowd outside the Hotel Texas. And then the next scheduled event was a breakfast hosted by the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. And this is another one of those moments where a theme that would come back, a major issue of the 1960s, is reflected in what President Kennedy talked about. Rather than hear from the president himself, we're going to hear from a young man who was there in the ballroom. a man named John Sparks, who was a high school student, and he was part of the band, the high school band that performed at the breakfast that morning. And in this next clip, he's going to talk about what he remembers from the breakfast, seeing Jacqueline Kennedy. He's going to speak a little bit about Fort Worth Congressman Jim Wright, and he's also going to talk about the president's speech, where he emphasizes the importance of Fort Worth in the defense industry, which would become a major factor as the Vietnam War escalated in the 1960s. This is John Sparks.
I'll never forget Jackie. The world was fascinated with Jackie. She's late to the breakfast, and when he finally gets up, he says, "Well, nobody, I'm the man that accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris, and that nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear." She was a fashion leader among ladies. I mean, she set the pace. I certainly remember him singing Jim Wright's praises, because I knew Jim Wright, and he was talking about what a contribution he'd made to Fort Worth. He launches into the role that Fort Worth has played in the defense industry, and this is kind of thanking him and publicly saying, this little thing over in Vietnam and Laos, the TFX made in Fort Worth will be flying over the skies in Southeast Asia. And he talks about when we were a frontier town, and he brings us up through this, the Second World War and building the B-24s and the B-36 and the 58s and all this stuff. So I can remember all kinds of things about the speech, and I was glued to it. I mean, I'm having to watch my band director and make sure I would do everything we're supposed to do. But I was wide open for, I'll never forget the speech.
It's pretty impressive, right, that a high school student was able to pick up so much on what the president was saying, particularly discussing the defense industry in Fort Worth. But, imagine for a moment if you were there to hear President Kennedy speak. I imagine it would be a pretty captivating experience, and we would all, including me, hang on his every word. And look at this next picture. It's really one of my favorite photographs from the trip to Texas. It's slightly blurry. It's not the best shot photograph. It was actually taken by one of President Kennedy's advisors, a man named Dave Powers, from the doorway of Air Force One looking down. But we see Mrs. Kennedy smiling, brushing her hair back. The president's climbing those sky stairs right behind her. And there's just an enthusiasm and energy in this photograph that you can feel. And it's so powerful and poignant to me because this is the last time President Kennedy would ascend the steps of Air Force One. He descended in Dallas, but when he was assassinated, the next time he would be taken aboard Air Force One, it was in his casket. And so we see this image at Carswell Air Force Base as the Kennedys are leaving Fort Worth, and there's a poignancy about it. And then behind them, the man in the sunglasses back here in the back, that is Secret Service agent Clint Hill. And Clint, most famously, jumped onto the back of the limousine during the assassination. He just passed away a couple of days ago at the age of 93, one of the last surviving Secret Service agents on the Kennedy detail. And it was a horrific experience doing that and being part of that assassination in Dealey Plaza. But in this photograph, an hour before it all unfolded, we see him smiling. We see a big grin on his face. Even in this blurry photo, you can tell he's smiling as he watches the Kennedys board the aircraft. And a picture like this, fuzzy as it may be, does capture a little bit of what was lost that day. The Kennedys made their way to Dallas Love Field, where 4,000 people greeted them at the airport, including a woman in this photograph who's holding a sign. You can see it handwritten there. I'm going to circle it for you. All the Way with Jack, which was another play on a 1960 campaign slogan, All the Way with JFK. And it's another one of those things where in this black and white photograph we can't really see much in terms of detail, but we have that exact sign that you just saw in that picture. Here it is. A high school student named Jan Siddle carried this sign at Dallas Love Field, and after the assassination she saved it, and it's in remarkable condition. I mean, this is a cardboard sign written in marker, something that would probably be thrown away, and yet we're looking at it here 61 years later, and it's still in remarkable condition. Again, another artifact that reflects the happiness, the excitement, the anticipation of the Kennedys on that trip to Texas as they made their way to Dallas. And the Kennedys got on board got into a motorcade for a 10-mile trip through Dallas. And we often see these photographs of the Kennedy motorcade, and it's usually thousands and thousands of people, this mass sea of people. We'll see a photograph like that in a minute, but I wanted to share this one too, which was taken by a high school student in Dallas. And you can see the Kennedys are actually going through a residential neighborhood. So people in this part of Dallas, at least, they could watch the president from their porch or even their kitchen window. So there was a stretch of that 10-mile motorcade where they were going through neighborhoods where people could just come out and see them. And we're going to hear from a young boy. He was 11 years old at the time, Johnny Rincon, and he had a very memorable experience watching the Kennedy parade that day in Dallas.
We walked what is now the Katy Trail. The Katy Trail is that old railroad track that crosses Cedar Springs, which is about 100 yards away from the crowd. Well, we thought this is a good place, so we sat on somebody's Cadillac car hood. And just the three of us with our feet dangling down. Now, mind you, the only one lane was open because of all those people parked their cars bumper to bumper up all the way, so only one lane was open. And across the street, there was nothing but Turtle Creek, which is a park. Nobody was there. We were kind of isolated, just the three of us. So we hung out as kids will, and we waited a few minutes, and the first thing that appeared were some motorcycles. I know now motorcycles always lead a presidential motorcade. And a few motorcycles came by and waved at us, and then a couple of limousines. And then around the corner, I said, oh my God, here comes that Lincoln Continental. And I said, guys, how do we look? So we just waited, and here it comes. First thing I could see was the governor and his wife. And we waved at the Governor Connolly, and then I could not help but just my eyes were struck on the pink outfit that Mrs. Kennedy was wearing. It was amazing, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and I was just 11 years old. And then slowly, Mr. Kennedy was right in my face. He was right in front of us. He was sitting by the passenger door, not the driver's side. So he was close enough to where I could have reached over and shook his hand, but fearing falling off that Cadillac, I didn't. But he waved at us, and I looked at his blue eyes, and he looked at my brown eyes. You know you locked eyes with somebody, that's how I felt. And I'll never forget that feeling. Well, it was a sunny, pretty day, as I told you, and it took us about, 15 minutes to walk what is now the quadrangle, and all those shops used to be homes, so we knew every neighbor and everybody. So we got back to school, got a drink of water, and then we were in our class, and only to see my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Radcliffe, with her head already on the desk crying. So the guy said, Johnny, go see what's wrong. And I said, wait a minute. I always got picked for these jobs, So I waited, and then I thought, here's the right moment. So I walked up to her and said, Mrs. Radcliffe, why are you crying? And she goes, Johnny, they shot the president. Well, an 11-year-old doesn't even know what that means. I told her, no, they did not, Mrs. Radcliffe. We just saw him. And that made her cry even more dramatically. And I'll never forget that day. And to this day, I go by there on the Katy Trail every day and kind of remember 50 years ago what happened or what I saw. But it has changed my life. It always, forget political parties and all that. I'm just thinking, I got to see the President of the United States. And I got to see Jackie Kennedy along with the governor and his wife. And I think history was right in my lap.
Now this picture is probably what you would normally think about when you think about the Kennedy parade through Dallas. There were 200,000 people that turned out to see them that day, and this is a picture of the crowd on Main Street. It's interesting that in Dallas, where the assassination took place, there were larger crowds than in San Antonio, Houston, or Fort Worth. And Dealey Plaza, to bring us full circle, Dealey Plaza is where the parade ended. This was the last mile of the 10-mile motorcade. Right after going through Dealey Plaza, they would be at the luncheon site. So to give you a little orientation, motorcade came down Main Street here, turned onto Houston. This is Houston Street right here. Made this curve towards the gentle curve downhill towards the freeway. This is Elm Street, and it was right here where I'm circling that the assassination took place at 12:30. And here's our building where we are today, the Texas School Book Depository building. And Allegedly, one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, fired shots at President Kennedy's limousine that day. I say allegedly because there's a great deal of controversy that might come up in the Q&A in a few minutes, but for right now, I'm just going to leave it there that shots were fired at the limousine. I want to turn your attention to this building over here. The castle building that you see here on the edge of Dealey Plaza, I want to highlight that. That's the old red courthouse. And the last person, the last voice we're going to hear from today is a woman who worked there, a social worker named Gretchen Coben. And she saw the Kennedys as they made their way from Main to Houston Street, and then she witnessed part of the assassination. Let's hear her eyewitness account.
And so he came by, and just before he came, some sunshine came out. So when they got up the street, this is, you know, I've told you before, the one thing that surprised me so much is that he was so close. You know, he was that close, and so was she. And they had big smiles, and she nudged him because this was an old, funny-looking castle building, and she pointed to him to look up at us, and he looked up and smiled and waved. And the thing that I've thought about so often is because we had black and white television, I didn't realize his hair was so kind of sandy red. He had a lot of red, that Irish red hair, very handsome man. So after they passed, we were just thrilled and so excited that we'd gotten to be that close to him. And so just as I remember seeing they rounded the corner and started, and the first thing that I remember, like it was just yesterday, is this loud boom, and it's there were the depository, the old records building and all. Those buildings were tall, and excuse me, the sound just echoed off those buildings. And at first you're just startled. You think, well, a car's backfired or something like that. And there was a pause, and then there were 2 more shots. And you're saying, what the? And then if you're looking, the people started running, and you could hear screams, you could hear commotion. So my supervisor, whose name was Lou Gillum, and I said, what is going on? What is going on? And so we didn't know, we stretched, and we could see this pink. So we realized that, you know, it had to be Mrs. Kennedy. And secret, there were people that were everywhere, that were very running, and just a lot of commotion.
Yeah. Eyewitness account from Gretchen Coben. The shots were fired at the limousine in Dealey Plaza, and of course that immediately changed the entire trip to Texas. Within 5 minutes, the president was at Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. And not only did this cut short, of course, the trip to Texas in November 1963, but it really kind of changed the trajectory of 20th century American history, the death of this one individual. And we really see that reflected in the things that were talked about during that trip to Texas. The space program, the civil rights movement for African Americans and Mexican Americans, the Vietnam War, all of these aspects of American history and culture. Within Dealey Plaza, we sort of wonder what might have happened had those shots not been fired on November 22nd, 1963. So when we think about that day, it's important to kind of put the trip in context to sort of look at the challenges that Kennedy faced as he was to run for re-election in 1964 and what he left behind. The voices that you heard today were part of the museum's Oral History Project, this archival initiative that has captured more than 2,500 voices from people all around the world. And you can find about 900 of these interviews online, as well as photographs, artifacts, including what we discussed today on the museum's online collections database, which you can access via our website at jfk.org. So I hope if you're interested in this subject and want to delve a little deeper into the primary resources that we have at the 6th Floor Museum, you'll take a look at our website. You guys have. Thank you very much.